Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk about some of the Timberwolves' offensive inefficiencies that really are pretty easily fixable. So I want to go through a couple of those items today. Plus, we'll look at some of the updated lineup data. How's Monte Morris appearing in different Wolves lineups? How's he being deployed by Chris Finch? And also, what are the Wolves' absolute best lineups so far this year? We'll also look at the Wolves Spurs matchup. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Happy game day. The Timberwolves are playing host to the San Antonio Spurs as their 7-game homestand continues. Obviously, a very winnable game for the Wolves tonight. But, of course, the last time the Wolves took on the Spurs, they collapsed in the fourth quarter and lost by a single point on the road at San Antonio a few weeks ago. So we'll preview that matchup toward the end of the show. The Wolves have actually struggled a little bit with the Spurs so far this year overall across the three games. So we'll talk more about that. A lot of stuff to get to first, though. Some offensive stuff. My take on some of the inefficiencies the Wolves have had offensively this year to this point. And then also a look at some of the lineup data with the Wolves obviously making the Monte Morris acquisition and just overall. We haven't really looked at lineup data here on the show in a little while. So we'll do all that on the show here today. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. Let's start with some of these offensive inefficiencies. So setting the stage for this, obviously the Timberwolves offensively have been a little bit disappointing again this season, albeit much better than last year, right? The Wolves so far are, depending on where you look, I like to use cleaning the glass. It takes out garbage time and end of quarter heaves. The Timberwolves are 16th in offensive efficiency as of right now. So coming into play Monday. So this includes the Wolves win on I don't know, Saturday, I guess, was the last time the Wolves played. So it includes the Wolves win, loss on Friday, win on Saturday. But overall, Minnesota's 16th in offensive efficiency, which is points per 100 possessions per cleaning the glass. Last year, they were 23rd. If you use Basketball Reference, I think that actually has the Wolves slightly lower in each, both last year and this year. So they're 7 slots better. And, if you just want to look at the straight up points per 100 possessions, they're 2.4 points per 100 possessions better this season than they were last year. Okay. It's still a little bit disappointing because you'd assume that a team with one of the most efficient scoring players over the last several years in Karl-Anthony Towns and a dynamic scorer in Anthony Edwards, and also a team that is one of the top 3 3-point shooting teams percentage-wise in the entire league, you'd think you'd at least be top half, but they're 16th. All that to say, they've been improving. They were bottom third of the league for quite a while earlier in the fall. And again, compared to last year, looks much better. So what have the problems been? Well, one of the things I've keyed in on the most, obviously turnovers, like that goes without saying. You don't need me to tell you that. If you've watched a handful of Wolves games this year, the Wolves games this season, you would know that they've turned the ball over way too frequently. That there's no question about that. They're 28th in turnover rate offensively. That's the number one issue. The second issue is lack of 3-point shots, just not shooting enough of them. Part of that is Ant has replaced some of his 3-point attempts with 10, 12 footers, which ideally he wouldn't, but he's also shooting the three better when he does shoot threes. So that's part of it. The other piece is the way that they've played in transition, which we'll get to in a second, has, I guess, removed some potentially open 3-point opportunities. And just overall, they're not shooting very many above the break threes. If you look at their shot profile, I'm going to see if I can grab it real quickly here. Yeah, here we go. Shooting frequency, according to Clean the Glass, the Timberwolves are 28th in non-corner threes. Not accuracy, but frequency. Okay, they're 6th in corner threes. They do shoot a lot of corner threes. Over 10% of their offensive shots, not three-pointers, more than 10% of their shots overall on offense are corner threes, which is 6th in the league. That's really good. But less than a quarter, 23.7% of their offensive shot attempts are non-corner threes, above the break threes. So they need to shoot more above the break threes. I've been talking about that quite a bit. They're still 3rd in three-point percentage league-wide. The problem I haven't talked about very much, and I think if they improved here would actually also increase the frequency of three-point attempts, is the lack of taking advantage of opportunities in transition. Now, I want to be really clear here. I'm not simply saying the Wolves should play at a faster pace. Minnesota right now is 25th in pace, according to Basketball Reference. And they were, for a little while, I actually think they were 30th. You go back to, mid-ish January, I believe they were 30th in the league in pace at Basketball Reference. So they're currently 25th. I'm not saying the Wolves should be playing faster overall. I'm saying they should take advantage of transition opportunities when good, solid transition opportunities present themselves. So what do I mean by that? Well, so Cleaning the Glass will break down transition opportunities on offense into transition opportunities off of steals and transition opportunities off of live rebounds. It's basically removing made opponent baskets from the equation, because it's not transition. Even if you play at a fast pace, those aren't truly transition opportunities. If you're running after makes, that's more on your opponent being lazy. And boy, have Wolves fans seen that their own team be guilty of that. That's more on your opponent playing poor defense than it is on you just playing in transition, right? That's not truly transition. It's just playing at a fast pace. Transition would be off of steals or off of rebounds. Minnesota, off of live rebounds, is dead last in frequency of transition. They're only getting out in transition 21% of the time off of a defensive rebound, which is dead last in the league. Last year, they were just a shade under 28%. So 7%, or they at a 7% greater clip, they were running in transition. And 2 years ago, which was the first, no, I guess that would have been the year that Finch, no, that was the first full Finch year 2 years ago. The Memphis playoff series year, they were actually 9th in running off of opponent missed shots, off of live defensive rebounds. So they've gotten slower over the past 2 years. A big reason for that is Anthony Edwards wanting to set up in the half court. And I also think Finch has rightly gained a little more control in terms of play calling, especially late in games here over the last several weeks. But all that to say, they're dead last in frequency of running in transition off rebounds. I'm okay with that, mostly because the Wolves are going to win games with their defense, not with their offense. They're a good enough half-court offense, and they've got good enough individual offensive players and good enough shooting that it's okay to slow the pace of the game down. You don't want to get into a shootout with some of these teams. We've seen the Wolves get sucked into this before by teams that like playing in transition. One of the reasons they have struggled a little bit with some of these faster, younger teams, Charlotte, etc., because even briefly with Detroit, San Antonio, because these teams are happy to push the pace, and the Wolves would rather slow it down. Like a bad team would rather get more cracks at it, right? The more shots they get up, the more threes, the higher variance of the game, the better chance they have against a number 1 seed like Minnesota. It's math, right? It makes sense. The Wolves, it makes more sense for them to slow the game down because their defense is so dominant. And when push comes to shove, the Wolves believe they can get a bucket. That hasn't always been the case this year, but it's been the case enough, to the tune of a 40-17 record so far. Where I think they could and should improve is running off of steals. According to Cleaning the Glass, the Wolves are 18th in frequency of transition plays off of steals. They're running just less than 2/3 of the time if they get a steal. So if they're and like this is a relatively the impact here is relatively low in the grand scheme of things. I mean, how many steals? The Wolves average 7.5 steals per game. So that means if I don't know that this is going to be clean math, but 7.5 steals per game. So round that up to 8 steals. That means that, if you get 8 steals in a game, the Wolves are only running 4 to 5 times on those 8 steals. But if they were running 6 to 7 times on those 8 steals, that's likely another bucket or two in transition, right? If you add 2 or 3 more transition opportunities a game, how many more times are you getting to the free throw line? How many more times are you getting an open, trail 3 from the top of the key from Karl-Anthony Towns, or a trail 3 from the slot, or a driving kick trail 3 from the slot? You say Ant takes it to the basket, kicks it out to Nickeil Alexander-Walker for an open 3 in transition. The frequency of transition opportunities, that the Wolves can increase that off of steals, off of opponent turnovers, off of their defense generating turnovers, that's low-hanging fruit that the Wolves should be taking advantage of. And I said this last year when the Wolves struggled overall offensively. The Wolves were miserable in transition. They actually were not only not pushing the pace, but they weren't successful when they did. Last year, they were 27th in points per 100 possessions in transition and 28th in points per in points per 100 plays in transition. Okay. This year, though, those numbers are both in the top 10, even though the frequency has actually gone down slightly in which they're running off of steals. They're better in these situations in transition. So Cleaning the Glass has points per 100 plays. How many points did the team score per 100 transition plays that came off of a steal? Play being defined by anything resulting in a shot, turnover, or free throws. The Wolves are 6th in the league in that stat. Last year, they were 28th. In terms of points plus per 100 possessions, how many points per 100 possessions did the team add through transition plays that came off of steals? They're 9th in the league this year. They were 27th last year. So the frequency is roughly the same, actually slightly down, but their success rate is higher. They're better. They're more mature. Conley makes a difference. Ant getting better makes a difference. Cat being healthy makes a difference. But the Wolves aren't doing it quite enough. If they run once or twice more per game on steals, I'm not saying off rebounds. I'm not saying, be a top 12 pace team. I'm saying, fine, be in the bottom 10 in pace, probably, remain in the bottom 5 in pace is best, but run on those opportunities that you have off of steals instead of slowing it down. How often do we see that happen where the Wolves pull it back and slow it down and get into the half court offense, which has been good recently, but it's better than the half court offense is getting out in transition and getting an open 3, a layup, or free throws. That's an area I think the Wolves could be more efficient and find some success, find some easy buckets offensively to take this offense from 16th in the league to 12th to 10th in the league. I think that's completely feasible. And this is one of those that could also lead to more of those above the break 3 opportunities, or just generally more 3-point opportunities. Obviously, more corner threes is better, but the frequency of threes overall could improve. And transition is going to help you do that. Also get to the line more often. That's something the Wolves do at a decent enough clip, but transition is another way to achieve that. Okay, I want to talk about some lineup data before we get to the Wolves-Spurs matchup. We're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Do you ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. Class exclusive Google built-in is your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. Plus, Nissan's incredible lineup also includes the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. It has room for up to 8, an expansive cargo capacity, and advanced available 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Pathfinder, or the Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. All right, let's move into talking about some lineup data here for the Wolves, and a couple things I want to bring up here. Let's first talk about the Wolves' best lineups. I then want to talk about the Monte Morris lineups, which obviously extremely small sample size, but how is he being used, and what do those lineups look like so far? And then also related to that, well, less Monte Morris, but overall some individual player on-off data that we can look at here. So the Wolves' best lineups overall this season, again, this is according to Cleaning the Glass, the Timberwolves' three best lineups among lineups that have played at least 100 possessions together. Their absolute best lineup has played 177 possessions together, which for context, that's their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, their fifth most used lineup this season. Okay, so their fifth most used lineup, 177 possessions, is in the 98th percentile league wide in terms of differential per 100 possessions. It's a plus 35. This lineup is, believe it or not, does not include Mike Conley. It's not actually anywhere remotely close to the preferred starting lineup. It also doesn't have Karl-Anthony Towns. It's Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards, Kyle Anderson at the 3, which this shocked me, Naz Reid at the 4, and Rudy Gobert at the 5. I was surprised for a couple of reasons. One, that Conley wasn't part of this lineup. And two, that this had Kyle Anderson at the 3 and not at the 4. Now, we talked about this before the season with the Wolves, re-upping Naz Reid and handing him more minutes and having a healthy Karl-Anthony Towns. I was a little worried about Kyle Anderson played more minutes at the 3, and sure enough, he's had a poor season overall, certainly compared to last year. He's been much better lately, and actually he's coming off his, I don't know, maybe his best game of the year, certainly a top 5 slow-mo game of the season in the win over Brooklyn on Saturday. But I was really surprised that this lineup was so successful on both ends of the floor. It's a 91st percentile offense and a 97th percentile defense. Again, Ant, Slow-Mo, Naz, and Rudy. The second best lineup that's played 121 possessions together, so not 56 possessions less than that last lineup. This is a weird one. You'll never see it again because Troy Brown's in it. Conley, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Troy Brown Jr., Karl-Anthony Towns, and Rudy Gobert. The next best, which is also above the 90th percentile, 91st percentile, this is, starting to make a little more sense. Conley, Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, and Rudy. So it's the starting lineup, but with Naz in place of Karl-Anthony Towns. The starting lineup, of course, their most used lineup is next. It's their fourth best lineup. It's a plus 11.5, 69th percentile. Okay. So the starting lineup with Naz instead of Cat is actually almost 12 points better per 100 possessions than the Cat lineup. Now, it's literally 1,000 less possessions, so that matters. But it's also almost entirely defensively. And that's part of a bigger conversation, which I'll get to here in a second. But the Naz, I guess the really short version is that the Naz defensive numbers are far better than Cat's. Cat's been better offensively, and it's not close. Naz is better defensively, and it's not close. Very weird. In fact, look at it this way. So that starting lineup minus Cat plus Naz, so the starters minus Cat plus Naz, it's a 10th percentile offense. Just 104.8 points per 100 possessions, but they're a 100th percentile defense, 81.5 points allowed per 100 possessions with Naz at the 4. But the version of that lineup that's, played 1,000 more possessions with Cat in there is a 62nd percentile offense, almost 121 points per 100 possessions. So, I don't know, 16 points per 100 possessions better than the Naz lineup, but the defense is just a 67th percentile defense. Very weird. Okay, so the things that stand out to me, number one, all 3 of the Wolves' best 3 lineups have Rudy Gobert in them. And in fact, all 5 of the Wolves' top 5 lineups, and I'm talking about lineups for over 100 possessions. The Wolves have 7 lineups that have played more than 100 possessions together that have a positive net rating. Rudy's in 6 of them. But again, he's in all the top 3. Cat is only in 1 of the top 3. Ant is in 2 of the top 3, and Conley's in 2 of the top 3. Okay, so that was my first takeaway there was Rudy's straight up dominance, which we'll get into on off. That it's kind of underscored there. Actually, no, let's do that now. Let's do on off. So Ant's the Wolves' best on-off player, and it's not close. He's a plus 10.1. They're 10.1 points better per 100 possessions when Ant's on the floor versus when he's off the floor. Rudy's a plus 6.9. They're far and away the two best Wolves. It's not close. Big drop off to Conley at plus 2.7. Nas is a plus 1.7, slightly better than Cat at a plus 1.5. And if you look at their points per possession on either end of the floor, the Wolves are 2.6 points worse per 100 possessions on offense with Nas on the floor. But they're 4.3 points per 100 possessions better with Nas on the floor on defense. Not what I was expecting. Cat's the exact opposite. They're 6.8 points better per 100 possessions with him on the floor on offense, 5.3 points per 100 possessions worse with him on defense. Not at all what I was expecting this year, but that's what we're seeing. And I guess the headline here is Ant and Rudy are far and away the Wolves' two best on-off players. Conley, Nas, and Cat are all clustered together as the Wolves' only other positive players. Alexander Walker is a slight negative. Jaden McDaniels is a negative 1.9. And then Slow-Mo is the only guy still in the rotation that's anywhere worse than that. It's a lot worse, minus 5.1. Below him, Troy Brown, Jordan McLaughlin, Shake Milton, guys that aren't in the rotation. Monte Morris, his mark isn't good here, but he also only has played 64 minutes in a Wolves uniform. So I'm not ultra worried about that. Now, if we look at Monte Morris lineups, because that's just straight up on off, Monte Morris lineups, on the other hand, have been far more successful. Overall, lineups with Monte Morris have played 124 possessions overall, and that's has a 92nd percentile differential plus 9.7. The most used Monte Morris lineup has actually not been very good. It's played 18 possessions together. That's with Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Slow-Mo, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Nas. His best lineup has played 12 possessions, and they're a plus 73.1 per 100 possessions, and that's Monte Morris, Ant, Alexander Walker, Cat, and Nas. Monte has not played all that much with Rudy Gobert, and those lineups have been decidedly worse. So the other thing is he's played quite a bit with Mike Conley, and those lineups haven't been as good as when Conley's on the floor with no Morris or Morris on the floor with no Conley, but it's a painfully small sample. And I think depending on who the opponent is, like for instance, against the Spurs, that lineup may work, right? Because both are very smart. Both are going to generate good looks. You should be able to beat the Spurs if you generate good looks for yourselves on offense and stay home defensively, play solid. And Monte Morris has been really good defensively, again, in 64 minutes or whatever in a Wolves uniform. But yeah, I think it really depends on the matchup, which maybe goes without saying, but it's important to underscore that. I think that, one other thing I should point out, the Wolves do not turn the ball over when Monte Morris is in the game. In fact, Monte Morris lineups have a turnover rate of just 8.9%, which is a 100th percentile lineup. Monte Morris himself has a turnover rate of 3.8% in a Timberwolves uniform. In, I said 74 minutes, 3.8% turnover rate for Monte Morris in a Wolves uniform so far. Incredible. Okay, so moral of the story here. Rudy's in all the Wolves' best lineups. Rudy and Ant are the Wolves' best on-off players. So far, Monte Morris has played better without Conley on the floor than with him, but it's clearly something Finch is going to keep trying, and I think he should against certain opponents. And then also Nas has been, the defensive numbers are far better for the Wolves with Nas on the floor than with Cat, but the offense is far better with Cat versus Nas. I suspect that's changed a bit here lately with Nas's shooting swoon that he's been in, especially the 3-point issues he's had. But all that to say, interesting lineup data here at the 2/3 mark of the regular season. Okay, I want to close with a Wolves Spurs preview for Tuesday night's game. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased in your life. So today I want to say how I really feel about something. You might even be thinking about the same thing. This is a Timberwolves podcast after all, so you're no doubt thinking about the Wolves, of course. Admittedly, not everything basketball's let me say that a different way. Nothing basketball is as important as whatever those really big issues are in your life. But it's important to get stuff off your chest. And for me, it's about the notion that the Timberwolves are not a serious title contender, which is, I don't think it's a straw man, because you just turn on any national program and they don't talk about the Timberwolves. Like, even when the Wolves were on national TV last Friday, that the All Access show, like every ESPN show buried the lead when it came to the Wolves, even though the whole point was like, hey, we're All Access Timberwolves. But it was after they talked about the Warriors and the Lakers, and like the shows last Friday morning, whatever, Get Up, the show hosted by Greenberg, first thing on Friday morning, like the whole first hour was, of course, NFL, but also talking about like who's more likely to make the finals, the Warriors or the Lakers. I don't know. They're both probably under 2%, right? It just nuts. Now, again, admittedly, not actually super important, but if it's something that feels important to you, then it is important to get it off your chest. And therapy can look different for everyone. And whatever it is you need to get off your chest, it's important to do so. Most of us has bigger problems than specifically how, networks are mistreating the Timberwolves or whatever your favorite sports team might be. But it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, so the Wolves are taking on the Spurs at home on Tuesday night. So far this season, the Wolves and Spurs have played 3 games. Minnesota won the first 2. And, they weren't blowouts completely. I think they both ended up being double-digit. Oh, no, they weren't. Neither of them were double-digit wins. The first game was that in-season tournament game back at the beginning of November. Minnesota ended up winning by 7. Got a little bit dicey toward the end. The next game was early December. Minnesota won that one by 8, held the Spurs to 94 points. But again, average margin of victory of just 7.5 points over those first 2. Last time around, Minnesota had that lead over the Spurs in the second half. Minnesota was up 13 at the end of the first quarter, up 12 at halftime, still up 10 going to the fourth quarter. I think even expanded the lead early in the fourth, and then ended up losing that game by a single point. And if you remember, that was more about the Wolves offense getting kind of lackadaisical, some silly turnovers, but just shot selection was not good, especially in the fourth quarter of that game against San Antonio. And then it turned into very lazy defense because, hey, we've got a double-digit lead and we're the best team in the West, and the Spurs are the worst team in the West. And then that gave way to, all of a sudden, the Spurs couldn't miss. And the Wolves locked back in defensively, I guess to their credit, midway through the fourth quarter of that loss to the Spurs. But you had, Wembanyama hit some tough shots. Devin Vassell went nuts. Jeremy Sochan hit a couple of tough shots. Doug McDermott was still on the team at the time. Who else? Keldon Johnson off the bench was good for them in that game. And the Wolves ended up losing by a single point late to the Spurs. It was a frustrating loss. It was kind of, right at the peak of is this an unserious Wolves team discourse in January. But the Spurs just don't feel like that good of a matchup for Minnesota anyway, largely because of the pace they play at. They're third in pace. They also, numbers-wise, they're below middle of the pack in terms of rebounding, but because of the length of Wembanyama and some of the different things they can do, they've got big wings. They're middle of the pack defensive rebound wise. They're bottom 10 in terms of offensive rebound, but I worry about how the Wolves handle them on the glass consistently. San Antonio beat them. They were +7 rebounding the ball. Minnesota only had 32 rebounds last time they played the Spurs. And it was again, a higher pace game, faster pace game, especially late. Spurs ended up shooting 43% from 3. Which, again, was a little fluky. The Spurs are literally the league's worst three-point shooting team. They're dead last in percentage, 34% from 3. They're 12th in three-point rate. So they're going to play fast. They're going to get up threes. They're mostly going to miss them, except for when they got really hot at the end of the game against the Wolves. So if you're Minnesota, I'll say the same thing. I'm pretty sure this was, my preview, my keys to the game before the last time the Wolves played the Spurs is play your game. Don't give them silly turnovers they can run off of. The Spurs are 20th in defensive turnover rate. They're not going to turn you over a ton, but they're capable of doing it, especially with their length on the perimeter, Trey Jones, etc. So, don't Don't be sloppy with the ball. Play your own game. Don't get sucked into a fast-paced game. And you should be fine. It's a very winnable game. I mean, the Wolves should not have any business splitting 4 games with the San Antonio Spurs. Like, this should be a win for Minnesota. And by the way, I should also point out the Spurs, since they beat Minnesota, are 1-11 over their last 12 games. Their only win being against Toronto. They had a 23-point win over Toronto, but recently they got blown up by the Jazz. They lost to the Lakers. They lost to the Kings. They got blown up by the Mavericks. They were blown up by the Nets before the break by 20. This is a team the Wolves should be beating and should beat them handily. Again, they have not blown them out yet. So the matchup, it doesn't scare me, but it's not an ideal matchup for Minnesota. It's an opportunity for the Wolves to kind of get back to what they need to do. It's also the front end of a back-to-back for Minnesota, as the Wolves then turn around and play, who do they play Wednesday night? It's another back-to-back. Oh, it's the Grizzlies, who the Grizzlies got blown out on Monday night by Brooklyn, who the Wolves just beat on Saturday. So it's kind of this, the bad teams are all playing each other, and the Wolves are playing all the bad teams in the middle of all this. So, get the first win, beat the Spurs. We'll talk about the Memphis game on Wednesday, but both very winnable games for Minnesota to try and, they're tied with OKC across atop the West. OKC now has a better net rating than Minnesota. Not that that actually matters, but it'd be nice to kind of push back on that a little bit and get some of the sour taste of the poor play on Friday and for parts of Saturday's game out of everyone's mouths as well. All right. The live postcast after the game Tuesday night, 7 p.m. tip, of course, for the game. And of course, if you can't watch the game live, you can listen on SiriusXM. Our friend Alan Horton on the SXM app. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves to catch every bucket from Wolves Spurs. The live postcast after the game will be on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. We will have the audio back here on all Locked On Wolves audio feeds. You may have noticed Monday's show published later. That's because of the migration we had on the back end for the podcast. So all of the, this show will be up early Tuesday. Majority of our shows will be up very early in the day. And then the postcast after, if you don't catch it live, will also be posted to Locked On Wolves now for the week. So we're back on our regular rhythm here in terms of posting times. All right, that's all we have for today. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, Locked On has launched its first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Once again, Locked On Wolves, the podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.